Y'all, let me introduce you to my gluten-free sourdough sandwich bread. I've been working on this bread for a while now, maybe a year, maybe even a little more. It is the quintessential sourdough bread for all sandwich making possibilities. The crust is slightly soft and the interior is the softest you'll ever have. I kid you not. So let's get into it and I'll show you how to make it. We of course need to start with our sourdough starter, and if you don't have one created yet, you'll need to go back through my post and video on how to create a gluten-free sourdough starter and get that active. So I pulled my starter directly from my fridge and I'll need to feed it now. As you can see, there is a liquid on the top which is called hooch, and that just means that it's hungry and it needs to be fed. For a less sour sourdough bread, pour this hooch off, but I like mine sour and even extra sour, so I'm leaving it right where it is. I need 100 grams of starter for this recipe, so I'm just going to add about 30 grams each of brown rice flour and water, roughly, and I'll see where I'm at there. I'm using ultra fine brown rice flour as my flour of choice. A lot of you have asked me how could it be gluten-free if you're using whole grain flour, but not all whole grain flours are wheat, barley, or rye. There's brown rice flour, of course, which is what I'm using, but you can also use buckwheat, which actually isn't wheat at all, teff, oat, sorghum, and I can't think of all the others, but if you check out my sourdough starter post, I have a whole list of all the types that they have out now of whole grain flours. Now you could use it this thick, but I'm just going to add just a splash more of water and see where we're at. This is exactly the texture I want it to be. I used to think the more flowy, the better, but I've since adapted that rule to a thicker starter because thicker actually means stronger, and also the more thick your starter is, the less sticky your dough will be when you're kneading it. I'll just clean up the jar a little bit with my little silicone spatula here. And I'm going to replace the cover, and I'm going to set this on the counter, not on my cool marble top counter, but another place that's a little warmer, and I'm going to let this rise until it's doubled in size. That could take anywhere from 3 to 4 hours all the way up to all day long. I cannot stress enough how you really need to be patient when making sourdough bread. It's not a difficult thing to do. Most of making sourdough bread is actually hands-off time. So I'll see you back here when this is ready. We're ready to make the dough. I'm going to add 650 grams of whole milk or a dairy-free milk substitute to the bowl. This might seem like an outrageous amount of liquid, and it is for one single loaf of bread. But I found with sourdough, you can up the hydration percentage significantly without affecting the dough, which ultimately makes for a tender, soft bread. Now I'll add 56 grams of melted butter. Again, you can use a dairy-free butter alternative. And I'm also adding in 10 grams of whole psyllium husks and 29 grams of granulated sugar. And now we can measure in our active sourdough starter. I'll just show you real quick how this has grown. Remember when I first fed it, it was about like half this. It was like an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter or an inch and a half. Now it's at least double that, but I don't know if you can see this. It's actually starting to fall. So we want to start using this right away. If you happen to not be able to mix your dough when your starter is ready, just put it in the fridge where it'll wait patiently until you're ready to make the bread. It's such a foolproof starter. I can't even stress it enough. I'm going to measure out 100 grams of the starter. It's thick, but it's not too thick. And if you look closely, you can see some of those bubbles breaking. Okay, that's 100. As you can see, there's not much left in the jar, but that's perfectly fine. I'll just put the lid back on this and put it back in the fridge until the next time I make sourdough. I'm adding 400 grams of Kim's gluten-free bread flour blend. 12 grams of kosher salt, and 8 grams of baking powder. This is not usual in yeasted or sourdough breads, but I do find it helps with getting better lift on the bread. All right, we've got all the ingredients necessary, and I'm just going to pop this on my stand mixer with the dough hook and mix it at medium speed for 5 minutes. You also can do this with like a Danish dough whisk and a large bowl, or even a wooden spoon. You'll need to be vigorous about it. And you can also use a handheld mixer with the dough hooks. Most of them come with dough hooks now. Okay, I'll scrape this into the center of the bowl. No need to transfer it into another bowl or container. And I'm going to cover it and let it proof until doubled in size. Now, y'all, if it takes overnight, it takes overnight. You need to be patient. So many people say to me that they've tried making one of my sourdough recipes or any of my gluten-free yeast recipes, and like 3 hours went by and it still wasn't risen, so they decided to bake it and it came out dense and like a brick. You have to be patient. See, here's my dough that is fully proofed now, and guess how long it took? 8 hours. Yep, it was nearly bedtime when it was ready. So what I did was I popped it right in the fridge until now, and it's the next day. This is cold dough that I just took out of the fridge. You can actually make this without refrigerating it, but you'll have to knock out the air bubbles, and check out my sandwich bread video on how to do that. Otherwise, I'm just going to dump this out onto a well-floured surface. Of note, this is a little of my Kim's gluten-free bread flour blend that I always keep in a little container as bench flour for this purpose. And I'll just knead it briefly because I want to get rid of those gas bubbles in the dough. If I were making this as a free-form loaf, I would probably leave those bubbles in there and just give it a quick shape. But this is specifically for a sandwich bread, so I want a more tight crumb. I'm just going to quickly shape this into a loaf shape. No need to flatten it and roll it up. I've got my 8.5-inch loaf pan, and I've lined it with a greased piece of parchment, and I'll carefully put the dough in. And let me just wash my hands real quick. Okay, I'll cover it loosely with plastic wrap and place it in a warm place to proof. And what do I always say about this? Be patient. It takes a while, especially for sourdough. This took what seemed like all day to proof. It was really more like 4.5 hours, but that's a long time when you think about it. I'm just being patient. So I'm going to preheat my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll just remove the plastic wrap and take a bread lom and gently, very gently, score the dough a little bit because it is very fragile. I've got a tablespoon or so of melted butter, and again, very gently, I'm going to brush the top with butter. This helps keep the crust soft. Now, if you have a pan of equal size, you can do this. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does help with oven spring a little bit. I invert the pan on top, and I'm going to gently place this in the oven on the bottom rack and bake it for 15 minutes. Then I'm going to remove the top pan, reduce the temp to 375F, and continue to bake for another 45 to 50 minutes, or until a thermometer registers at least 210 degrees Fahrenheit. As soon as it comes out of the oven, remove it from the pan onto a wire rack, and if you have any leftover butter, go ahead and brush that on all sides of the loaf. Now comes the hardest part of this whole thing, waiting until the bread is cool enough to slice. If you don't, it's gonna be gummy on the inside as you try to slice it. Please resist the urge. My bread has cooled, so now we can slice it. When it's first out of the oven and cooled down, the crust will still be a little crunchy, but once it's wrapped in plastic wrap or foil, it'll soften considerably. But I can't wait any longer. Check this out, y'all. How freaking good does this look? I don't think we can buy gluten-free sourdough bread anywhere. But even if we could, would it be this good? Would it look this good? I don't know. It would be about the size of a cracker probably. Am I right? They're always such little pieces of bread for those store-bought loaves. But look at this crumb, y'all. It is so incredibly soft and so flavorful too. It tears apart like real bread too. I just can't get enough of it. I just can't get enough of any of the sourdough breads I've made so far. It doesn't even need anything on it. I could just eat it plain. But I bet your kids would love it in their lunch boxes with some peanut butter and jelly maybe. Enjoy.